In 1993, Sega controlled about 55% of the US console market. 8 years later, it was gone from the console business. Most people think they know why Sega lost the console war. The usual explanation is simple: a series of very bad decisions. But there's a problem with that explanation, because at the moment Sega supposedly set its downfall in motion, it was winning. So how did a company go from market leader to suddenly losing control of the entire industry? The most common explanation for Sega's collapse is simple. Sega lost the console war because it kept making terrible decisions. First came the Sega CD, an expensive add-on that produced only a handful of good games. Then came the 32X, another attachment released in 1994, just as the industry was preparing to move to an entirely new generation of hardware. Players now needed a tower of power just to keep up with Sega. And when they finally launched their next console, the Saturn, the problems only multiplied. It was expensive, notoriously difficult to develop for, and its surprise early launch caught retailers and developers off guard. At the same moment, Sony entered the market with the PlayStation and executed far more cleanly. Put it all together, and the conclusion feels obvious. Sega didn't lose because of the market. Sega lost because Sega kept getting it wrong. But that explanation hides something very odd. Successful companies rarely start making catastrophic decisions overnight, unless something inside the company has already started fracturing. So what was going on with Sega? When you look closely at the timeline, the collapse doesn't start with the Saturn. In the early 90s, Sega wasn't a struggling company trying to survive. It was one of the most aggressive and successful companies in the entire industry. By 1993, the Genesis controlled over half the US console market. For the first time since the crash of the 1980s, Nintendo was no longer the clear market leader. That kind of momentum doesn't usually disappear. Market leaders typically carry that advantage forward into the next generation. Sega seemed perfectly positioned to do exactly that. The Genesis had massive brand recognition, a huge install base, and a lineup of franchises that had helped define the entire 16-bit era. And yet, within just a few years, that position completely unraveled. The Saturn struggled, Sony's PlayStation surged ahead, and Sega's hardware business collapsed so quickly that by 2001, the company abandoned the console market entirely. So the real puzzle isn't why Sega made mistakes. The puzzle is why so many of those mistakes all point in the same direction. Because when you look closely, Sega's most disastrous decisions weren't random. They were symptoms of something hidden below the company's surface. And once you see what was actually happening inside the company, the Sega CD, the 32X, and even the Saturn start to make a lot more sense, because those weren't independent mistakes. The reason those decisions started piling up so quickly was because Sega was no longer acting like one company. It was operating as two competing power centers. On one side was Sega of America, the division that had turned the Genesis into a market leader. Under then-President Tom Kalinske, the American team spent years learning how to fight Nintendo in the West. They pushed aggressive pricing, bold marketing, and a steady stream of games aimed at older audiences. By the early 90s, that strategy had worked. Sega had taken the lead in the United States. From Sega of America's perspective, the next step was obvious: protect the momentum. The Genesis still had a massive install base, strong brand recognition, and a library of hit franchises. If Sega extended the life of the platform and transitioned carefully to the next generation, it could carry that audience forward. But Sega wasn't being run from California. It was being run from Tokyo. Inside Sega of Japan, the incentives looked completely different. Japanese leadership believed the industry was about to shift rapidly toward more powerful hardware and advanced 3D graphics. Sony was preparing to launch the PlayStation, and Sega's leadership in Japan believed the company needed to move aggressively into the next generation to compete. That shift changed the balance of power inside Sega. Kalinsky later described the moment the American division lost control, stating, "It went from where I was able to do whatever basically I wanted to do to all of a sudden I was being dictated to." So while Sega of America wanted to extend the Genesis era, Sega of Japan wanted to accelerate the hardware transition. Those strategies collided in a series of decisions that made Sega's platform roadmap increasingly chaotic. First came the 32X, which launched in late 1994. Then, just months later, Sega revealed the Saturn, a system designed primarily by Sega's Japanese engineering teams and built around priorities shaped by the arcade business. Sega was effectively asking players to invest in the past while the company was already building the future. Even the Saturn's architecture reflected the pressure of that moment. After seeing the PlayStation's specs, Sega engineers added a second SH2 processor late in development, creating the Saturn's notoriously complex dual CPU design. From the American side, the conflict felt obvious. As Kalinsky later put it regarding the Japanese division, "We're on 55% share of the market. Why should we do what you're doing?" Now, none of these decisions looked catastrophic at the time, but together they revealed the real problem. Sega wasn't executing a single strategy. It was executing two incompatible strategies at the same time. And a global console platform cannot survive that kind of internal conflict. Once that conflict took hold, Sega's collapse wasn't just possible. As we will see, it was inevitable. The first time Sega's internal conflict became visible to the entire industry happened in May 1995. At the Electronic Entertainment Expo that year, Sega planned to introduce its next console to the North American market, the Sega Saturn. But instead of announcing a future release date, Sega made a shocking move. The Saturn, they said, was already on sale, which was surprising news, especially for most of the retailers and developers that were supposed to support it. As Sega of America president Tom Kalinsky later admitted, "We were forced to introduce it. We didn't have enough hardware. We didn't have enough software." The decision instantly exposed how fractured Sega's strategy had become. Then Sony took the stage. During its own presentation later that day, Sony Computer Entertainment President Steve Race stepped to the podium. He said just one thing.
$299.
In a single moment, the contrast between these two companies became unmistakable. Sony looked coordinated, confident, and prepared. Sega looked like a company rushing to outrun its own internal conflict. And from that point forward, the momentum of the console war began shifting rapidly away from Sega. The fallout from that moment spread like wildfire. Retailers felt it first. Because the Sega Saturn had launched without warning, many major chains were completely excluded from the initial shipments. Stores that had supported Sega for years suddenly found themselves locked out of the launch of a new console. Some responded by scaling back their support for the system entirely. Some chose not to sell the system at all. The retail relationships Sega of America had spent years building were suddenly extremely damaged. Developers were watching the same chaos unfold. Studios had expected months more time to prepare games for the Saturn's North American release. Instead, the console appeared on shelves with very little software ready to support it. At the same time, Sony was aggressively courting developers with a platform that was easier to work with and launching on a clear, predictable schedule. As confidence in Sega's roadmap began to erode, more publishers started committing their biggest projects to the Sony PlayStation instead. The sales numbers soon reflected that shift. By the end of 1995, Sony had already sold roughly 800,000 PlayStations in the United States, nearly double the Saturn's install base. Within a year, the gap widened dramatically, with PlayStation reaching about 2.9 million units compared to roughly 1.2 million Saturns. What had once been Sega's greatest strength, its relationships with retailers, developers, and most importantly with players, was now turning against it. And as those partners moved towards Sony, the balance of power in the console industry began to change. And once that shift began, it became almost impossible for Sega to reverse. Looking back, it's easy to treat Sega's collapse as a story about bad decisions. The Sega CD, the 32X, the Saturn launch. But those decisions weren't random mistakes. They were the visible symptoms of a deeper structural problem. Sega wasn't operating with a single strategy. It had two divisions pulling the company in different directions. Sega of America wanted to protect the momentum of the Genesis and transition carefully into the next generation. Sega of Japan wanted to move aggressively into new hardware and reassert control over the company's global direction. Individually, those strategies might have made sense, but inside the same company, they produced chaos. Add-ons overlapped with new consoles, hardware launched before it was ready, retailers and developers lost confidence in the platform. Sega didn't lose the console war because the competition was stronger. Sega lost because the company that created the success of the Genesis stopped acting like one company. It was competing with itself. And in the console business, that is one opponent you can't beat. So I'm curious to know what you think. Was Sega's collapse really just about bad decisions? Or do you think it was because the company stopped acting like a single entity? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy gaming, my friends.